So this is the default setup, apparently.
Okay.
So I'm going to show you how to change all of this. So this is how Caddsman generally comes up to start with. We generally have the theme set to, I think, black 2010. So that changes the colour around the outside. And then to change your background from bright white, system setup, and then colour mix. And workspace, the workspace option we change to a colour that's not so bright on the eyes, but still allows you to look at it like it's on a bit of paper, so something like this. Then you're going to want to probably want to put some different different buttons around the side that you want to use in particular. You might want that up the top. So you can just drag them around by grabbing the dots on the end. And if you want to go customize, you can turn on different bars for different things that you want. And if you want to add a particular option to these bars that's just already in Architect, you're going to want to go commands, and then you're going to want to find the command that you want. For example, if you want a button that inserts a plane, you just want the free plane option that's by points, and you can drag that up onto the bar. And you can do that with any of them. They're all in there somewhere, but you've just got to find them. They're in groupings that tend to make sense. And if you want your properties panel on the other side, like I used to, just grab whichever one you want to move, you grab it by the top, and then you've got to drag it over the picture that appears for the side you want it for. And for this, you drag it over the panel you want it to be part of, and then down. And this one you drag up, and say you want it at the bottom of that one, you drag it to the bottom there and drag to whatever height you want. I'll leave it a bit bigger for doing Mac. So the first thing that I would do if I was going to start making a macro and I was just working from the default of Caddsman is I'd make a new, in Windows, I would make a new, somewhere that you could put the whole lot of different macros in the same folder. Let's go to Architect Data and we'll put a macros folder in there. And then you can put in a new text document and call it text. And we want to call it .mac, M-A-C. If they don't have that extension, then they're not a macro. And Windows complains, but that's okay because we do want to change it. So we're going to want to set the macro folder to a library in Caddsman. So to do that, we go System, Library, New, and we'll name this one Macros. And we'll click the extra, and then we want to find where we put that folder. So in this case, I've put it in Architect Data Macros. Okay, so that's the folder, and we want to check the file extensions, and we want to make sure .mac is checked. If it's not, then it won't be able to read the macros. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise you can run into some problems. And then I would add a button to run that test macro. So I'd go customize macros, new macro. And we're going to call this one test. And then we need the particular string that runs macros, which, so if you don't know what it is, the way to find out what a command is to find it and run the command and cancel out of it. And then it comes up down here on your command line. And then you can copy it. So we're going to add that to a macro. And Control V to paste because you can't right click in these fields. And then you want it to say macros, which is the name of the library. And then an arrow, and then we called the macro test.mac. And then we can drag it up and add it to our list. And if I click on that, it attempts to run a macro, but the macro doesn't have anything in it, so it's not going to get very far. So we've got a test macro, and I'll pull that over there. Yes, this is essentially just Notepad, but with a lot of stuff for changing the color of your text and stuff that's fancier than normal Notepad. It makes it a bit easier to see what you're doing. So it's called Notepad++, and if you want to find it, I think that you just Google Notepad++ download, and there, that is the right one, and you can go download whichever version you want. It's a free program. It's a text editor or a lot of, it's a very simple text editor that a lot of programmers use, which when you've got something like that, it's quite helpful to have the comments. So these hashes mean that the text after that isn't running Caddsman. Caddsman just ignores that. Having them in a different color. Having command come out in a different color, because that helps you check when you, in case you don't have command at the start of your line when you want it. A couple of things like that makes it a bit nicer. Let's say you want to make a macro that sets your settings for when you're drawing a plane. So what you want to do is set all your settings so that when you start drawing a plane, instead of turning up like whatever your default is, it turns up with specific settings. So first thing you want to do is work out what would you do if you were doing it in Caddsman. How would you do it? You'd probably change it on the properties panel, but in this case we want to use the option that comes up down here. That doesn't bring anything up down on the command prompt. So to do that, you would change your properties for your plane, and see that comes up with a command that's !plane properties down here. And then there's a bunch of settings. So what you can do is highlight that, copy, or you can also go in there and press up to do it, and then put in some just random stuff. And it comes up with what options you have. If you change your fill to solid, it'll come up with intensity as well. To pattern, it'll come up with even more options. So then you can see what all the names of all the different bits that you're going to want to call in the macro are, which makes it a lot easier to write your macro if you know what you're trying to make it say.
So you could do a screen snapshot of that so that it makes it easy to refer to.
Yep, like that. Helpful. It's easiest to do that if you work out what keyboard shortcut it is. Windows Shift S. Set it so that you see all the options for pattern, let's say. You want to do a pattern. Maybe let's do something before we do a pattern. Let's just do, let's do a hatch. That way I don't have to find a pattern to use. And in our test macro, we can go, we want to go command. And that means that you want to type it on the command line in here. That's all that means. And then you want to write plane properties because that's what we've worked out we need, the function we want to use. We can just paste that there. Now next we're going to want to say what plane properties we want to use. We want to set. So on our list we've got the first property you might want to set is color. You want to set anything that could change what you want because obviously you want to be able to run this regardless of what your settings are. Let's say we want to make it color 5, layer.
So abbreviations will do.
50? Yes, so long as it's a unique on the list. If the abbreviation is too abbreviated, say you use C, and see you've got copy, color, and cross on the list.
Yep.
That won't work, but COL works for color.
Okay, you don't need any punctuation between what you're typing?
Not in this case. So the spaces separate the value, they're just value pairs. So you just have the space between each. And that works. Style 4, so dashed line. Capitalization doesn't make any difference. Weight 0.25. Edge, no. Shadow, no. Fill, hatch, because that's what we want it to be. So let's say you feel like it's getting too long. I think that you've got 255 characters per line that you're allowed to do. And this is quite a few less than that. But let's say that you've decided that that's getting too long. You don't want to have to scroll all the way across on your thing. What you can do is go enter and then go command and then just keep going. You don't have to have them all in one big long line. That's particularly helpful if you want to comment some of them out when you're doing testing of a macro. So you're not sure if what's going on here with plot size. You want it to be separate. Let's put anchor up here as no, and then we'll on this next one we'll put plot size original. And what you want at the end is an OK. Otherwise it won't keep going. It doesn't matter if what you're doing is in the same order as it shows up on that list. So long as, for example, if you're changing to hatch, you don't want to do angle before you've changed to hatch because it's a specific setting just for hatched planes. So let's say you set plot size original, but there's two different plot sizes. How does Caddsman deal with that? So what we're going to do is save, minimize that, and run test. What does this say? It's changed our color. It's put our plot size to scaled. So what you'll actually find is when you copy, paste, when you're in that menu, if you change original, it changes plot scaled and original, but it's scaled and fixed is what it actually comes up with here. They're what you want to change for in the macro. You'd probably be better if that was what you wanted. You would probably be better if you found that they were too hard to read, to be doing multiple, just going command and doing multiple lines. Say you go color, style, weight, and then you go command for that next bit. And so let's maybe set that to scaled. Angle to 45 degrees. Cross is cross angle, and we'll set that to 90 degrees for this. Spacing, I'm going to leave it 10, and pattern, I'm going to set to 2. Let's see how that goes. We'll run test, and we've got a complaint, can't match scaled to a list item. I've probably spelt it wrong, knowing me. SCA, no. Apparently you have to use original in macros. And that's going to be, yep, that'll work. So scale doesn't. And then when you insert your plane, it looks like that. I don't know why you would want a plane that looks like that in particular, but you could of course set all those settings to what you actually wanted your plane to appear as.
Looks like blue poles.
Yes.
So change your pattern back to 1.
Yeah, and you'll get them.
Change your spacing to 100.
Pattern to 1, spacing to 100, save, and run it, and that's what you get there. It's because it's dashed.
So how would you fix that?
You would make it not dashed. So you would change your style to 0. So that's just there. Rerun that. Yep, that's changed the style to 0. Mustn't have fully saved before I ran it. So that comes up as something like that.
That looks quite good in the hashed pattern.
And let's say that at the end of your macro, you actually wanted to draw the plane using the free plane drawing. You could add that to the end of your macro. So you could go put plane draw points at the end, test, and then it takes you straight into that. plane drawing. And good practice is it to the start, do a hash, which makes it a comment, which means that people can read it, but the computer can't. It's invisible to Caddsman. And write what the macro is about. So changes planes to blue cross hatches or something like that. Doesn't matter, whatever is going to make sense when you come back to the macro in a year's time, or you've given it to somebody else for them to use, whatever's going to make sense then, that's what you need to write at the start of the macro so that you know what macro you're writing. I've just saved that as a test mac, but, and that's great for testing it, but you want to keep your test macro as a macro for when you're trying new macros. Otherwise, you have to add a button every time you want to start a macro. So when you're done making a macro and you're happy with how it's running, what you need to do is in the macro, you go File, Save As, and save it into that same macros folder, and we're going to call it plain blue, I don't know, whatever you want to call it. We find it's helpful to have the most broad term at the start of the name, because that means that they'll clump together all your macros that change planes, for instance. So you can save that, and then...
Did you deliberately not put spaces in that name?
Yes, but I don't think it makes a difference. I think you can leave spaces in that name, it will be fine. But I did that on default.
It's not a bad habit to get into for things around macros, because space actually means something in macros. To not have spaces in something like a file name just makes it a little easier not to have things confused later on.
Yeah, so we've found that if you want to use a file name with spaces, you have to put it into a variable first. Otherwise, it tries to treat it as spaces. Because spaces separate different variables, it tries to treat it as multiple variables, and it goes, hang on, I don't know what the second word of the file name means, when it's trying to pass it as a completely different setting, when it only actually needs to take a setting, one setting. So we're going to add new macro, call it blue. And in this case, it'll complain that the name can't have any spaces. So in that case, you have to have no spaces in the macro name, which you'll notice is the same as all of Caddsman's names of things. And then you're going to want that same command macro run execute. Oh. Helpful if I don't put it in twice. And then we want, so it's really helpful to use Windows V for this, particularly when you're doing multiple macros, because then you can just copy all the different macros names and paste them in individually. And then we can bring it up here. And I don't really like blue hatch as my icon. It's not a very nice picture. So what I can do is come down here, change button image. Let's say
How did you get that, Rose?
How did I get the...
Menu up.
Okay, sorry. I click on the text. I then right click. I come down to change button image and then click on what I want to use. Then I right click again to bring it back up again, and I want to go edit button image. And it brings up something where you can, a little editor that you can, if you click up there, you can change which color you're using. Let's say you want a blue and you want some crosshatchiness. You can use a line tool to make it a bit better line. Anyway, it's not a very good picture, but anyway. You can draw whatever you like, or you can copy a larger picture that's still quite a small picture, but a picture that you've got somewhere else. And you can paste button image if you've got an image on your clipboard. So what you can do is you can go here and you can copy this image, copy button image, and right click here again and paste button image, and then it'll have the same picture. And then you can edit it and, I don't know, paint bucket. That's not going to work because they're all the same color. Filled rectangle. Let's say that's what you want. I don't know why that would be what you want for that macro, but let's say that's what you want.
You
And
just
you can
take a
change
copy
that
or photo of the pattern that you made.
Yeah, so to do that, I would maybe go snipping tool. Probably not the best bit of pattern, given that's not what the macro's for.
Use one of the other ones on the right-hand side.
Yeah, let's grab just a little bit there and customize. Let's see. Right click on that, paste button image.
There you go.
And so you've got a picture of your hatch. You just want to make sure it's small enough. So you've just got to make sure that you pick your picture the same size as you want it to end up. It's a pixel size, so I don't know.
Can you have that ribbon bar that you're working on? Can you have a ribbon bar that's just macros?
Yes. So you go here on toolbars. You can go create and call it macros, for instance. Whatever you want to call it. And it comes up here.
So you could call it a number of series of different macros if you wanted to.
Yeah, they don't like going on the same line when you've got the customized thing open, but if you close it, you can drag them up to the same line. So that's just for a menu like this one. It's called macros because that's what it comes up in the toolbars, but it doesn't show that anywhere. Okay. However, what you can do is add a new menu, and that brings up this, and you can drag that in there. And that one is the pull down menu. So you can hide that back and right click on that and
rename.
Paste button image, or rename, you could call that macros.
So you could have one that's plain macros, wall macros, or whatever else, other different types, and just lump them all together if you wanted to.
Yeah.
So,
you need to do an enter after the name, otherwise it doesn't put it in the fit thing.
So you might want to call this the planes drop down, and then you put a whole lot of planes macros inside that drop down. And then
and just drag it over and then drag it into that white space, and it'll put it in the drop down, and then it'll have the picture and the name. Oh, and you can change that down here, what it's actually doing.
So what we've got on our menu is I've actually got
image
a
and
menu
text.
bar with one that's called areas, which I use for my concept planning stuff. I have another one which is called cross sections, and we have a whole lot of macros that you use when you're doing a cross section. Here we go. Rose will show you.
Yeah, so they're these ones here, room size, materials. I've just got a picture of this because I've got the other Caddsman up at the moment. Hatches, tones, all the different things we can use in sections. All our macros for shadows. We've also got up here our 2 different tests, a bunch of different macros we run on Windows. That macro there just inserts text incrementing up, which I find useful for counting up stairs. And with
dimension styles, line types.
Yeah, a lot of different ones. Yeah, with that's drop down there is for we've got a couple of different ways of inserting rectangular planes. They're new. We've got a drop down here under scale that we've got 3 different scales because we weren't happy with just the first one. We wanted different ones. So we've got some that you can use points for scaling and stuff, which we find useful. Yes, so they're the different drop downs we've got. We've got quite a few different ones. So let's say that you wanted something a little bit more complicated. Let's say you want to do square tiles, but you want to ask the person inserting the tiles how big you want the tiles. So to ask a question, for something to show up here on the command that it's just asking the user, you want to write prompt. MPT. The colours also help me check my spelling. And then I'm going to just type what the question is. What size tiles? There is a fairly short limit on that. I'm not quite sure exactly what the limit is, but it's not hugely long. If you find that your question's getting cut off, it's because you've written too long a question. And then what you're going to go is S1 equals, or this doesn't matter. What this is doesn't matter so long as it's something generally short that you can remember, well, that you can use further in the macro. But it can't start with a number. It has to start with a letter. Let's use TS or just size. And then we'll go, so get number. You could also do get string, which lets you put in letters as well, but in this case we want a number. And we're going to go default 400. So what this means is that the variable size is going to be filled with a number that it's going to ask the user for. And by default, that number is going to be 400.
Can you do that for height and width?
Yes.
So if you wanted a 600 by 300?
Yes, you could do that. We've got a macro that does that somewhere.
You've got to get tricky with that one because, of course, you can't use hatch. You've got to use a pattern and then scale the pattern appropriately. So you create a pattern which is a 1 millimeter by 1 millimeter square, and then you can scale that 400 times in the height and 300 times in the width, and you'll end up with a rectangular pattern. So yes, you can do it, but you got to be a bit tricky.
So in this case, we're going to go, we're going to separate spacing out. As a separate thing. And we're going to go spacing, and we're going to put size as its variable. And save that. That should ask us. So what we're going to do is hit test. What size tiles? 350. And then it's going to get us to place it. And it's put our spacing at 300. Oh, 350, sorry, which was what I typed. So
if you want nice square tiles rather than 45-degree angle ones,
you want that angle to be 0. And let's say you want color 8 tiles because you want them grey.
In the same sense, you could ask it to give you an angle as well.
Yes, in the exact same way. Ang equals get string, which does the same thing but lets you put in letters as well. In this case, we don't actually want letters, but I'll just for proof of concept. And we want default to be 0.
35. Okay.
And
you might want to actually add a prompt.
Yes, that would be helpful. While it will get you to put it in, it won't be very helpful in how it asks you. I think it just says calculator input or something, which isn't very helpful when you're running the macro. And in here, we want to put ang as what it's got. And then we run test. And let's say we're happy with 400 tiles, so we just press enter. And it's complaining that a string is expected. So evidently you can't use a string for that. Oh, I think that's a problem with default.
I also think you have a problem with angle because angle is a setting for a variable in that.
It may be, but in this case,
make it ang1.
I think you can still do it.
Ooh.
Probably not best practice, but you can still do it. So the problem was that when I set the default to 0, but I was asking for a string, which is a series of letters and numbers, or like it can include both. And because I didn't have quote marks around it, it was reading the default as a number, which basically all you need to know is if you've got quote marks around it, it's a string, but if you don't, it's a number.
So typically if you want to get the user to put in a number that you're going to use, you'd use a get number. But if you want the user to put in a word, you'd say get string. So if, for instance, like in our macro for room names, it says, what is the name of the room? You would use a get string to get a room name. But in this case, where you actually want a number because you're using it as an angle, you would, normal good practice would be get number, not get string.